Hello and welcome to this lecture on safety in work at heights. This is a continuation of previous lecture. In the previous lecture, we saw about scaffolding, and in today's lecture, we will be discussing ladders. This is part of the construction management course, postgraduate certificate in industrial safety. Let's just have an outline of the unit. The name of the unit is Safety in Works at Height. There are 4 parts to it. The first part was about scaffolding. In the second part, which we will be discussing today, we'll be talking about ladders. The third is working on roofs, and the fourth would be about use of related machinery and equipment, which is used to handle objects on the site for transporting. So in today's lecture, we will be looking into detail about ladders which are used primarily in construction site. What are the safety aspects that we need to look into? So in this lecture, we'll be covering the major hazards that are related to ladders. And secondly, we will be looking at the types of ladders. And in the third part, we'll see the various safe practices during the use of ladders. Now, what are the major hazards related to ladders? Falls, as we all know. Falls from height from using the ladders is a very crucial part of safety while using ladders. It could happen while ascending the ladder or descending the ladder. It could happen because the ladders are not secured in place. For example, the ladder might not be having a stable ground, or the ladders may not be secured at the top. So whatever it is, falls are a major risk factor while using ladders. Now let's look at the second major hazard that is related to ladders. The second major hazard related to ladders is electrocution if a ladder touches electric source. Now we know that there would be times when there would be an overhead electric line, or there might be some source of power supply on the construction site. And most of the cases, these sources of power supply may not be secured as in a domestic setting or in a proper residential setting or in a commercial setting or in a house or in a building that has been completed. So the risk is that the metal part of the ladder, because mostly the ladders are made of materials like aluminum or some other metal which can be conducting. So what we need to take care of is that we need to avoid electrocution. So the ladders have to be in a place, if it is working in a place where there is a risk of electrocution, we might not go for an aluminum ladder. Instead, we might use a fiberglass ladder or a wooden ladder. It is not just enough to look at the area before setting up a ladder. There is also a risk of electrocution at the above eye level. For example, if we are leaning the ladder against a vertical surface, the extended part of the ladder might hit an electric wire, which might not be visible from the ground level. So we have to make sure that not only from the ground level, we also have to make sure that there are no risk of electrocution even at the point of extension of the ladder. The next major hazard is back injuries, and these happen when people who use ladders for reaching out, they might stretch a bit or they might overreach standing at the same position. And this can cause back injuries. And so we look into detail how this can be avoided. But before that, we look into the fourth major hazard that is related to ladders. The fourth major hazard is injuries from being struck by falling or carried ladders. We know that in construction sites, ladders have to be transported from one place to another. So what happens is there could be a risk of ladders falling down. So, or even while parts of ladders might hit against people and then cause injuries. So the way to avoid it is, as far as possible, we try and not to carry ladders through crowded places. And then we also make sure that adequate indications are given to show that ladders are being transported or there is a risk of danger from ladders. Now let's look at what are the safeguards against these hazards. First, we look at the safeguards against falls. First of all, we need to have a careful selection of ladders for appropriate tasks. Sometimes we might need ladders which require us to stand for a longer time for doing a work. For example, if there is a painting job, it might not be sufficient to use a ladder which is unstable or a ladder which requires support. We might want self-sufficient, self-standing ladders for such purposes. The other aspect that we have to take into consideration is that the length of the ladder. We must not take ladders which are either too long for the task at hand or too short for the task at hand. The risk of using ladders which are not adequate for a particular task at hand is that we might be tempted to use other support systems. For example, we might use a drum to increase the height, or we might use some other, maybe placing the ladder on another object which might be unstable in order to reach the height that is inadequate for us. So what happens is that these are a strict no when we use ladders, and so it has to be appropriate, neither too long or too short. And the other aspect is that when ladders are used, it's not just for the required tasks. Like for example, if the height that we want to work at is 2 meters, then we need to have look at ladders which are 2 plus 1 meters, because there is a requirement that a 1 meter of extension is needed while we place a ladder to access a higher surface. Let's now look at the next safeguard. The next safeguard is inspection and testing before each use. And this means when we have a ladder, we need to make sure that it is of a proper make, like whether the standard IS codes are followed. We also have to ensure that all the parts of the ladders are functioning properly. The treads, we check whether the treads are in proper position and fixed quite properly to the side rails. We also have to make sure that the joining bolts and nuts are working properly. In all, we must make sure the ladder is stable. So inspection and testing before use is a very crucial aspect. We also have to make sure that the surroundings, for example, the base on which the ladder is kept, is free of uneven surfaces and that it is stable. So these are some of there should be a small inspection that we need to carry out before using ladders. The next safeguard against falls is a solid placement of ladder on a leveled, non-skid surface. Most of the accidents related to ladders is caused by either people falling from the ladder or the ladder itself skidding and falling. And this is usually because the ladders are not placed firmly on the ground. And for this, we need to have a level surface which is non-slippery. The other important part that we have to remember is that in case we don't have sufficient support from the ground, it is also advisable to submerge that end of the ladder, the bottom end of the ladder, into the ground. The other part that we need to take care of is the top part of the ladder. This part has to be fastened to if it is a higher level that we have to access. The top part has to be fastened properly to make sure that the ladder is stable. Now let's look at the next safeguard that we need to follow. The next safeguard is for electrocution. I had mentioned in the previous part that electrocution is a major risk on construction sites, especially because the usual electric supply lines are not secured as in normal cases. So how do we make sure that we don't have the risk of electrocution while using ladders? First is the careful selection of materials used for ladders. As I mentioned earlier, we must be using non-conductive materials. So this would eliminate almost all metals. We know that aluminum ladders are quite sturdy for construction purposes, but in order to avoid electrocution, we might go for fiberglass or wood. And the next is inspect each area to detect electrical current sources. So this would be the job of the site manager to make sure that there are no current sources in the vicinity where the ladder is used for work. Now let's look at the next hazard risk and how to safeguard against it. The next one is safeguard against back injuries. So even if it's not a fatal injury, even injuries which can require hospitalization, etc., we are to be avoided while we are on the construction site. So back injuries are a common problem while working on construction sites, and this is usually because of a tendency to overreach. So if a person is working on the ladder, there is a tendency that they might overreach to either to the sides, they would lean onto the rails, and this can cause back injuries, and these have to be avoided. Now, how do we do that? The first way to do it is training employees on how to carry ladder. So even while carrying ladders, it has to be done in a group, preferably instead of a single person doing it, because the imbalance of the load can cause back injuries. And in some cases, we might need a group of people to carry a ladder instead of maybe one or two. So the employees have to be sensitized that it is okay to have a group, or even if that means stalling the work for some time, we need to follow that procedure. The next is, do not overreach. If there is a particular position that an employee has taken while on the ladder, overreaching can create a lot of grievous injuries. And the way to do it is, we have to sensitize the employees that it is okay to move the ladder from one position to another for each work, and to carry it for the same purpose. And that is a better practice for safety than trying to overreach and complete the task. Now, let's look at the safeguard against injuries related to ladders. There are other injuries which may not be related to just the use of ladders. It could be happening during the time of transportation of ladders from one place to another. Now, how do we safeguard against this? This is a good construction practice that we need to follow. We should avoid using unnecessarily long ladders, because that would require carrying it from one place to another, and that can risk of hitting other people or hitting other objects and causing them to fall down. So always, as mentioned earlier, use the ladders that are adequate, just enough for the particular task at hand. The next one to avoid injuries related to ladders is, it's a pretty easy and one that requires common sense. Do not carry ladders in a crowded area. Not only is it logistically quite a task to carry a long ladder through a crowded area, it can also avoid injuries to other people in that area. So ideally, it should be done before the place is occupied or after the place is occupied, which would mean that there is a certain amount of planning that the project manager has to do before executing a task that requires the use of ladders. The other thing that we can do is that we can also have employees, or even post employees as lookouts, to warn people that there is a risk of having a risk of dangers of ladders being used. So it would be a permanent someone positioned at the site for till the time the task is over, to make sure that the people in the area are sufficiently warned about the risk of long ladders or huge ladders being transported around. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we need to follow certain design codes that are mandatory. These are standard design codes. So the design of the ladder shall conform to the IS code 3696 part 2 1991. Now, the codes also specify the design of a metal ladder, and that should conform to IS 1977 1975. The codes also talk about the design of an aluminum alloy ladder, and that should conform to IS 617 1975. So whenever you see a ladder and it has got a name label on it specifying as to which code that it is complying with, if it is an IS code ladder, it would be usually complying with the IS 3696 part 2 1991, and this has to be borne in mind by any project manager who wants to ensure that standardized ladders are used on the construction site. Now, we had discussed the different types of, we will now discuss the types of ladders. There are mainly three types of ladders that are usually used in construction sites. One is the stock ladders. The second is step ladders. And the third is the extension ladders. So now we'll talk about step ladders. Stock ladder, before that I need to mention about the stock ladders, which are the common type of ladders that we use in our houses, which need support from both top and bottom. But we'll be discussing in detail step ladders. These are self-supporting ladders. As you can see, they are usually A-shaped, and they have a top flat surface and sturdy ground support, and usually they are used for accessing heights which are less than 6 meters. The minimum width at the top is 30 centimeters, and the spread, which is the capacity of the ladder to spread the legs of the ladder to be kept wider. So that is about 25 for every 30-meter length. One of the aspects that we need to take into consideration when we use step ladders is that we can use it for climbing, but it is not advisable to stand on the top of the ladder to do some work. We just completed step ladders, and we'll now discuss extension ladders. As the name specify, extension ladders are extendable, which means they, for storage purposes, it is easy. They would be of a certain height, but they are the two parts of ladders overlapping with each other, and they can be used to access heights. And for this reason, they are called portable ladders, and the heights are extendable. And the overall length is less than 18 meters usually. We don't go for ladders which are more than this. And the number of sliding sections is maximum 2. As you can see in the figure, there is a foot assembly, or it's also called shoes. Then there are rails, and if you notice closely, there are 2 sections, one sliding on top of the other. Now, usually it has to be leaned onto another surface, so they're not self-supporting or stable as the step ladders that we saw earlier. But extension ladders can access it has got a higher range than the step ladders. Now let's look at some of the safe practices while using ladders. The primary important part of ladders is that it has to be stable, which means it has to have a stable ground, it has to have a stable top. So for the ladders like step ladders, they by themselves, by the design, they are stable because they are self-supporting. But when we come to extension ladders, because they are not self-supporting, because they lead onto another surface, a vertical surface and the ground, the stability of it is very important. Let's see how we can how we can ensure that the stability is maintained. First of all, primarily very important aspect that has to be kept in mind, ladders should rest firmly on the ground. Now there is a thumb rule that is required for the angle at which the ladder rests against the wall. But before that, we'll see what is the extension that a ladder is needed to have while it is placed. So the standard rule is that 1 meter of extension should be there on top of the resting surface, the vertical top, which means if a ladder is resting on a particular height, there has to be a 1 meter, this extension should be 1 meter, and that is mandated by codes. Now, what about the angle that the ladder makes with the vertical surface, and what is the distance that a ladder has to have from the vertical surface? So even for that, there is a thumb rule, and that is ladders should be placed at a distance of 1 meter from the base for every 4 meter height. So which means if we have a 4 meter height ladder, then it has to be placed at a distance of 1 meter from the vertical surface. Or the other aspect to remember is that there should be an angle of 75 degrees. For steeper angles, the ladder has to be secured at the top. So any angle which is more than 75 degrees, what we need to do is that we have to make an additional change, or an additional safety mechanism has to be in place, which means we have to tie it on the top. So now we have seen what are the factors that determine whether a ladder is stable or not. Now we look at the other safe practices of ladders. We saw already that metal ladders have an electrocution risk. So what we do is, there is a selection of material. Again, we make sure that non-conducting materials are used. The next aspect is something that the employee or the worker has to make sure while ascending and descending the ladder. Ascending and descending the ladder is not the same way as you would use a staircase or steps. While using ladders, we have to face the ladder even during ascending or descending. So the direction of movement has to be facing the ladder, and this is a crucial aspect to keep in mind, because several accidents happen because people tend to walk down the ladder as they would walk down a stair. The next is about the extension ladders. So how do we ensure the overlap? If you remember, there were these two sliding parts in the extension ladders, and so there has to be a particular section that has to overlap. Now, for overlap, two rungs of overlap should be for ladders which are of less than 5 meters, and there should be a three rung overlap for ladders which are of height greater than 5 meters. Now, the rung of a ladder is a step of the ladder. So, which means if there is a height which is less than 5 meter to be accessed, then the overlap need to be just 2 steps. So, the extension ladders can be overlapping for 2 steps. Now, if the height is more than 5 meter, the overlap has to be for 3 rungs, which means 1, 2, 3 steps, there must be overlap for that. Now, the next safety practices. Now, whenever we climb and come down from a ladder, there is a method called 3-point method that we have to make sure. Now, the 3-point method is easy. Probably from the term itself, you would understand that it requires 3 points of contact whenever a person is climbing or descending the ladder, which means either 2 hands and 1 feet should be touching the ladder, or 2 feet and 1 hand should be touching the ladder, or during the time of ascending and descending. The 3-point rule can only be broken when the person has reached the ground level, or the person has reached on a top place where there is a base where they can stand, and then they do not need the ladder anymore. So at all times, a 3-point contact, 1 hand and 2 feet, or 2 hands and 1 feet on the ladder is to be maintained. Let's now look at the summary of what we studied today. One is the hazards related to the ladders. That's what we first learned. Then about the types of ladders. We talked about the step ladders, the stock ladders, and extension ladders. And then we also saw the safe practices while using the ladders, and we also talked in detail the 3-point method. Now let's to summarize it again. The first thing would be, what is the type of the ladder? How do we choose the ladder? So it could be a step ladder or extension ladder depending on the purpose that we are using it for. If it is self-sufficient and self-stable, then we use a step ladder. But if we want to access heights more than 5 meters, then we need an extension ladder. The next is about the ladder height. What is a height for safe use of ladder? The extension beyond the vertical surface after placing the ladder is 1 meter usually. In some codes they say 3 feet is enough, but 1 meter is a good code that we commonly use. And the other is the height of the ladder from the vertical point to the horizontal point, and the distance of the ladder from the vertical surface to the horizontal. We saw a ratio of h is to h by 4, or an angle of 75 degrees. The next is the material that we use for ladder. We've seen that aluminum and fiberglass are preferred in case there is a risk of electrocution. And the other is, when we are using a ladder, the first thing that we need to make sure is the base of the ladder. Does the ladder have safety feet that anchors the ladder? Then we check the steps of the ladder. Are the steps safely connected to the frame? Then we also may, in terms of if we are using a step ladder, we also have to make sure that the lock bars are present, because if the lock bars are present, if they are not present or are not functioning properly, there is a risk that the ladder might just tip over, or even the legs might come unstable and cause the person using it to fall down. The other important aspect while using safety treads on ladder is that we need to make sure that there is no grease or oil spill on the ladder, because this can cause slippage and cause people to have accidents. And the other is ladders, the steps of the ladders are usually made in such a way that there is more friction, so you might see grooves in it that helps in ease of climbing and prevents falling down through slipping. The other important aspect is to make sure that the ladder is certified through various codes like Indian standard codes. We did discuss which are the codes that are dealing with the the ladders in Indian IS codes. Now, to better understand what we learned today, we'll just look at a small video as to what is the standard operation procedure while using ladders. So before starting any assignment, we go through a pre-start process, which is normally there in any construction site, and then make sure everybody knows what their task is. So a proper orientation on the construction site is important so as to know how to, even new people who are joining the site are well sensitized as to what are the risks that are present. Then the emergency response plan that we always as part of construction activity that we check. Next is that how do we choose a ladder? So usually we use industrial grade ladder, and again that has to be complying with codes, the various codes. This is not in an Indian context, but in an Indian context we'll be following the Indian standard codes. The next is how to set up the ladder. So before we set up the ladder, we make sure that the site is good. We make sure the ground conditions are good for setting up the ladder. It has to be stable. No uneven grounds are permitted. And then usually if we are using a ladder which is not self-supporting, then we have someone supporting the person while climbing. Again, we saw that there is a 1:4 ratio while setting up a ladder, or 75 centimeters as we saw. The extension of the ladder above the point of vertical support, it's 900 millimeter according to the code that is shown here, but we usually follow 1 meters. The next is a safe use of ladder. Only one person should climb a ladder at a time, and then if you notice, the person is using a 3-point contact while coming up and down the ladder. It is advisable not to carry objects along with you while climbing the ladder. Instead, you should use equipments which are appropriate for the same. There is a use of buckle belt because in case a person has a tendency to overreach, it is better to have a lanyard or a buckle belt so that people know that they should not be overreaching beyond a certain point. While we are finishing the work, it is also better to have someone support you from the bottom during the dismantling of the ladder and once the work is finished. So I hope you have got an idea of how to use ladders safely on a construction site. And this is part of the lecture on unit on safety in construction, in working at height. And so in the next lecture, we'll be continuing with the same unit, and we will be looking at working on rooftops while on construction site. Thank you.
Do you wish to be part of a television studio like this or any other media system?